This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more, or visit tremfyaradio.com.
Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's revolutionary idea is something a little bit different. I'm talking to the leading statistician, David Spiegelhalter, about the Bayesian revolution in probability that completely changed the way human beings understand chance and what can be known about the relationship between past, present, and future. This is a story that starts in the 18th century with the man himself, Thomas Bayes. It passes through the French Revolution and its aftermath, which is one of the reasons why we put it here in our sequence of revolutionary ideas. But it only really comes to fruition at the end of the 20th century, when it made a real difference to lots of very different things, from political polling to artificial intelligence. It's a long story. It's a complicated story, but one of the things that David Spiegelhalter is best known for is making complicated statistical ideas easy to understand. Stick with it. It's a really fascinating conversation. David, maybe we should start with the man himself. It's his name that has now been attached to the revolution, the Bayesian revolution, if that's what it is, and we'll be talking about the time frame over which this unfolds. But it is a story that goes back to the 18th century, and it starts with a pretty obscure Presbyterian minister called Thomas Bayes, who came up with a solution, potentially, to a deep puzzle in how human beings to that point had thought about probability. So let's start with the puzzle before we get on to his solution. How was probability framed conventionally in the middle of the 18th century? And what was the Bayes puzzle that he then came up with a completely original answer to?
How it had been seen mainly up to then was as a probability of future events. If you imagine flipping a coin, we'll judge that the probability would be a half that it would come up heads. And people had done the calculations, people like de Moivre, earlier in the 18th century to show that if you flip a coin, say 200 times, you'd expect it on average to come up heads 100 times, but what the variability around that would be, which is a sort of deduction from the assumed probability model to work out what the probability of what you might observe in the future. And that had sort of been done. But what was called the inverse problem had not been done. In other words, if you had just observed a sequence of heads and tails and you were trying to judge what was the underlying probability, the underlying chance of coming up heads, because you didn't know whether the coin was balanced or unfair, that problem had not been done. And that's what Bayes did.
And in a way, one of the ways I think this was conventionally understood at the time was a gambling problem. And in some ways, isn't it? It's the difference between the conventional view trying to work out the odds of something happening and something happening and trying to work out if you're being cheated by someone who's rigged the deck or rigged the coin. It's from effect back to cause. Given that something has happened, can we work out whether the underlying cause is not what the conventional probability would tell you.
Yeah, and for a long time it was referred to as the probability of causes. In modern language, we would more think of it as applying probabilities to parameters. When we do statistics and build statistical models, we've got things we actually observe, and they tend to be called X and Y. And many people might remember having to learn this stuff. And the things that are sort of underlying what we can't directly observe but are generating the pattern of data, we tend to give Greek letters, theta and sigma and all this sort of stuff, and they're called parameters. They are the underlying unobservable drivers of what we observe, and statistics, you could say, is about taking the data we've got and trying to infer something about their values.
Before we get on to what Bayes himself did, the thought experiment that he ran, I think one other piece of context here is that the biggest puzzle of all, then maybe and now, is trying to understand whether we can infer from the world we see around us some primary cause to which, he was a clergyman, to which people have conventionally given the name God. And this is a gambling problem. It's quite a prosaic challenge. And at the same time, for some of the people at this time who were drawn to the approach that Bayes adopted, did it at least hint at the possibility of coming up with a scientific way of understanding the likelihood that God is behind all of this?
Yeah, I mean, behind all of this is David Hume, is an empiricist philosopher in the 18th century, and who was deeply skeptical of the idea that from observations alone we could conclude there was some final cause behind it, some deity or something like that. And there were lots of people trying to counter that. Bayes didn't mention that, or didn't mention anything about God in his paper whatsoever. But of course, his paper was not published during his lifetime. He never tried to put it into a publishable state. It was only after he died that his young friend, Richard Price, who we might come on to, got the papers and gotten ready for publication. And in his introduction to the paper, he went way beyond what Bayes said. And he said that Bayes' argument was, and I quote, "thus to confirm the arguments taken from final causes for the existence of the deity." So he argued that Bayes' paper provided a means of proving the existence of God from the observations. And it seems to me this is going much further than either Bayes intended, but certainly what you can conclude from Bayes' paper.
It's a stretch. And like you say, let's come on to that, because one of the questions is about the trajectory of this whole story and its ebbs and flows, why it may have fallen out of fashion. But let's go back to the paper that Bayes wrote, that Price then publicized. What was in it? What did he say? What's the basis of this whole story?
I'm going to read his aim. Apparently he was a very dull clergyman. His sermons were very dull, and the paper is almost unreadable in terms of its length and its horrible Newtonian notation, etc., etc. But some bits of it are enormously clear. His definition of probability is incredibly clear. And first of all, I should mention that because it's so important, is that his definition of probability has nothing to do with the long-run frequency of events or symmetries of dice and cards. It's a gambling definition. It's to do with, if you've got a gamble where you might win £1 if something comes up and you get 0 if it doesn't come up, and if you expect, on average, get back 70p, then you must think the probability is 0.7. It's to do with your expected gain, and a gamble reflects what later became known as the degree of belief in the event coming up. So it's to do with totally unique situations. And so this, in fact, I think, just that definition is his absolutely major contribution to thinking. He was entirely subjective, judgmental definition of probability.
And just to be clear, what's so radical about that is it puts the emphasis on the expectation of the gambler rather than on the cards or the dice.
Exactly. So it's a property, as I would say, a relationship between the gambler and the outside world rather than a property of the outside world itself. So that's his definition of probability. But he also assumes that there are such things as underlying chances in the world. For example, if you've got a drawing pin, a thumbtack, and you don't know the probability that it's going to come up If you flip it, it'll come up with a spike upwards or lying on its side. And you flip it 10 times and it comes up spike upwards 3 times and on its side 7 times or something like that. You might think, well, the underlying probability, the underlying chance, the true chance of it is somewhere around 30%. And what he solved is the idea of, well, how close to 30% is it? His aim in the whole paper, which is specified beautifully clearly right at the start, is this. Given the number of times in which an unknown event has happened and failed, required, the chance that the probability of its happening in a single trial lies somewhere between any 2 degrees of probability that can be named. So, for example, you flip this drawing pin and it comes up spike up 3 times and on its side 7 times. He provides a solution for, well, what's the probability? What's it reasonable to believe about the underlying chance lying between, say, 20% and 40% in a single trial? So he's trying to infer what it's reasonable to believe about the underlying chances underlying a sequence of yes-no experiments.
And what's then the illustration that he gives of how this would play out in...
This is the other beautifully clear illustration he gives. This is the one bit of the paper that's really clear to read. People sometimes refer to it as a billiard table. It's not a billiard table. It's just a table. And what he imagines is that you've got a table in front of you and somebody throws, with your back turned, somebody throws at random a ball on it, I say a white ball or something like that, and it lands at some point along the table. They then take it away. And your job then is to guess where it landed. But the only information you have is that he's then going to tell you, you're going to throw other balls onto the table at random. He's then going to tell you how many lay on the left side of the unknown line and how many lay on the right side of the unknown line. So it's a bit like the thumbtack, or so whether it came up spike up or sideways, this is just on which side of the line it lay. I'll use the same example. You're just told we threw 10 balls and it came up on the left side of the line 3 times and on the right side of the line 7 times. And you have to guess where the line is. Now, you kind of feel it's somewhere around, 30% of the way along the table, but you haven't thrown many balls. If you'd thrown 10,000, you'd have a really good idea of where it was, but you haven't got many. So he came up with what it would be reasonable to believe about where that line was, and that belief is expressed as a probability distribution. So a probability for an underlying cause, essentially.
I imagine some people listening might think it's going to be a big stretch from that to proving the existence of God, or where this story is going, because this is going to be the basis, among other things, of the machine learning revolution, self-driving cars, all sorts of things. We're going to try and tell a story that gets us from this boring 18th century Presbyterian minister to some of the wilder reaches of Silicon Valley. What is so radical about it? And is one of the things that's going on here, so if I've got this wrong, you're going to have to correct me, but essentially the effects that we're talking about, we're trying to get the underlying cause, even though this isn't a causal relationship, but the effects are the pieces of information that you get, and you're trying to identify where the line is. Each new piece of information that you get clarifies it. So as you say, 10,000 times. So this is not a sort of fixed probability. This is a process, right? Isn't that part of what's so dramatically different here? That this is an ongoing story about refining your expectations with each new piece of information you get.
Yeah, we've already come through 2 really revolutionary ideas that, as you said, have had an extraordinary impact in recent times. And the first, which I mentioned, is the fact that we can apply probabilities to our ignorance, to things we don't know about, to underlying causes or underlying states of the world, underlying parameters. And it's quite reasonable to give those probabilities. That is a huge idea, which was fought over for the next 200 years.
And just to be clear, that's so radical because before that, the expectation was you could only talk about probability on the basis of things that you knew.
The probabilities of degree of belief had been around as an idea. It had been suggested, but it hadn't been put on a formal basis in this way. And then the other idea, as you mentioned, is this is an algorithm for learning from experience. If we make assumptions about what's generating the data that we're observing, but there are certain aspects of that data generation process we don't know about, for example, where the line is on the table, then this tells you in a sequential manner, as we get more data, how do we revise our opinion in the light of that new evidence? And so it is the correct way to update our understanding and our knowledge from new experience, and is now considered the underlying theory for how our brain works.
Given that when it's described like that, what it sounds like is that it has a clear practical benefit over previous ways of thinking about probability, because it precisely is about improving the state of one's knowledge. It's about getting better at something. One would think that by the time, say, Price, and then particularly, I think in the story, a French philosopher, mathematician, Pierre-Simon Laplace, also took up the idea. So Price earlier on, and Price is the person on this podcast that we discussed in relation to Thomas Paine. So he's not a boring, obscure clergyman. He's an electrifying clergyman. At the time, he was thought to be, among the most important people in the world, up there with Thomas Jefferson as a polymath. He publicizes Bayes' thinking, his paper, his result, but it's Laplace in France, before, during, I think he got away during the Terror, and after the Revolution, who also tries to make this the centerpiece of probabilistic thinking. One might expect that once well-known people started to promote it, once it got out of the hands of the obscure clergymen and into the hands of the dominant intellects of the age, its advantages would be clear for all to see. But they weren't, were they? It was extremely contentious.
Well, on the timeline, Bayes, it suggested that he actually wrote this about 1750, died in 1761, it was published in 1763, and then completely independently, Laplace published his paper in 1774. And the point is, Laplace's paper, there's a massive difference between that and Bayes's appallingly written, really opaque explanation. Laplace's paper is extraordinarily clear. It looks similar to how, I taught this stuff to Cambridge students. And he wrote about this and promoted it, and it became, a very serious idea. And Laplace treated the two faces of probability with equal importance: the probability of future events, the idea of chances that we're used to, but also the probability as a measure of our beliefs about underlying causes. He treated them both really seriously. And as you said, he got away. He managed to turn from being a sort of ruralist, then he was a supporter of the revolution, he was a friend of Napoleon, and then he criticized Napoleon when Napoleon fell. And partly because of that, afterwards, when people look back on Laplace, they really thought he was a shifty character, and he developed a very bad personal reputation, which I don't think helped the view of the work he had done in probability. And so gradually over the 19th century, this view of probability as a degree of belief fell out of favor. And, there were still arguments throughout the 1800s about what does probability mean. And the view that probability was, in a sense, a property of the outside world, that it was to do with frequencies, took hold. Not for everybody, but there were people like John Venn of the Venn diagram who strongly promoted those ideas and was deeply against the idea that probability could be used as a measure of degree of belief. So these two ideas just carried on kind of in parallel, with some, more theoretical people, more mathematical people still favoring the degree of belief interpretation. But the 19th century was also a time of massive data collection. People like Quetelet and others just accumulating huge amounts of data, plotting the graphs. And that, in a way, that data-rich environment encouraged the idea of probability being just an expression of the way that characteristics vary in the population, the sort of distributions that we're so used to seeing, rather than probability being used for inference about underlying parameters, as they would now be called.
What I know about the history of 19th century statistics, which is not much, it's the sort of school version, but it's that almost a discovery was made as this new trove of data was uncovered about regularities in the world out there. The example that's often given is, I think, the number of Prussian cavalrymen who'd be kicked to death by their horses was remarkably invariant from year to year.
Well, it followed a Poisson distribution.
And so there was an expectation that what was out there, now that all that data was available, was much more regular than had been thought or believed. And so there was a kind of objectivity out there was part of the suspicion of this inverse method that it started from subjectivity or even from, as you say, ignorance. It starts, its basis, the thing it's anchored on, is not, well, look at all these numbers of the things that we now know. It starts with what we don't know. And for some people, that doesn't feel scientific relative to the science of vast data collection.
Exactly. And the two aspects about Bayes' work that I really love are the two that attracted the most criticism. The first is just the basic idea that probability can be an expression of personal belief, because that roots it very strongly as a subjective relationship with the outside world. And this was felt to be deeply unacceptable to many people. And the other aspect is that in doing this, what was then called the inverse method, and this learning from experience, you had to start somewhere. You had to start with what's known as the prior distribution, your prior beliefs, before you got any data. Now, Bayes got around that in his nice little table experiment rather neatly by describing that it starts off with someone throwing a ball on while your back's turned, while you haven't seen it. And that, in a sense, specifies that there was a uniform distribution, that the line was equally likely to start on any end of the table. It's a way that's kind of avoiding the problem, because that's saying, well, we start from a position of ignorance. It could be anywhere, equally likely. And then the algorithm works very nicely, the updating. And so one of the other criticisms, and Laplace did the same thing, assuming what's called a uniform distribution over hypotheses. And that was another continuing criticism of the method, that people kind of felt they had to use this uniform distribution, which was in many situations not reasonable. Is it, before you start observing each day, was it 50-50 likely that the sun would come up each day? And these are sort of, I think, rather fatuous arguments, went on for years about the probability the sun's going to come up tomorrow and things like that. The point being that this prior probability was a real issue identified in the 19th century and for the following 200 years as well.
When I was reading about this, I found myself thinking, we'll move on from Price and Laplace in a second, but I found myself thinking, one of the weird aspects of this story, Bayes was very obscure, but the two people who publicized the basic idea were incredibly well known at the time. I mean, Price was this legendary polymath, radical philosopher, mathematician. Laplace was, I think, the best-known mathematician in France. And, this extraordinary long career, so with all the twists and turns of politics, he was a survivor. But he didn't just survive, he was incredibly productive. And these were two of the legends of the age. They are now obscure. And the Bayesian idea that they promoted fell into obscurity. And I couldn't work out whether they damaged it or it damaged them, in the sense that Price was a radical, like you say. Laplace gained a reputation for being a little bit unreliable politically, and he fell out with a lot of people. He survived the terror. You have to be quite slippery to do that. He fell out with Napoleon. I think Napoleon made him a minister and then ditched him because he thought he was useless. Price was a radical. Whether these people promoting this idea made the idea seem a little suspicious, or whether actually the fact that these were the two promoting it helps explain their fall into obscurity, because the idea fell away for the best part of 100 years.
Oh dear, this is where the fact that I'm not a historian of science really comes in, because, what are the reasons? I would actually say that, I'm glad they did promote it, because otherwise Bayes' paper nobody would ever have noticed at all. And so I'm really glad that that was promoted by the people. I'm not sure. These are quite radical ideas, and, we'll come on to what's happened more recently, and it has always been associated with some quite radical thinkers, dissenters in a way, modern dissenters. It's carried on. Now it's become mainstream, but for a long time, it was not mainstream at all. So I think it would have happened anyway, because of this data-rich obsession of the Victorian age with categorization, with counting, with labeling, with producing distributions of the number of suicides and the number of this, that, and the other. So it became an age of enormous data exploration, and I think that would have dominated the discussion anyway.
Is it true that during the period where the idea fell into relative abeyance, there's still a distinction between the people who were theorizing about probability, the people who were doing it in the academy, but also, as you say, the sort of Victorian, almost civil service view, or the German view that this is, statistics is part of statecraft and all of that. So let's call it the high-level version. And what people were doing practically in various kinds of professions, like in insurance, where the practical value of this seems unarguable, that you're starting from at least some ignorance and you are constantly updating on the basis of new information. Your business depends on your ability to update so that you become relatively less ignorant. That somehow there was a subterranean, I almost want to say underground continued existence of this approach over the period where the high-end version of it tried to push it away.
Well, in insurance, they didn't even realize they were doing it particularly. I mean, in insurance, you've got this idea, you've got a whole history of claims in a particular area, and you want to quote a premium to a particular person or a particular company or a particular type of house or whatever. And you've got a little bit of local data about them. So then very naturally, you've got your prior distribution about what the sort of claims might be. You've got from all your database. And then you want to tune it to those particular circumstances. And you end up very naturally producing a kind of weighted average between the local data and the more generic data. And it's exactly a Bayes solution. They didn't put it in those terms at the time. They didn't realize they were doing it. It just is the way to solve a complex problem. And that's where Bayesian methods then and now, of course, have come into their forte. It's a way of handling really quite tricky stuff. When you've got multiple sources of information and you've got a whole wodge of background knowledge that you want to apply to a particular circumstance, that's what it's designed for. In other words, you really have got initial judgment. You're not starting from a blank sheet each time you quote an insurance premium. So it required people with real practical problems to solve for its real strengths to come out.
When and how did it start to reappear as a formal method with defenders and academic advocates in the 20th century?
First of all, I think we need to get back to this much more fundamental idea of what is probability. And the idea of probability, that it's something completely subjective, started coming up again as a strong argument in the 1920s, particularly with Frank Ramsey from Cambridge. There's this extraordinary man, absolutely my hero. He's the person I'd most love to meet. Unfortunately, he died when he was 26 in 1930. But before he died, he had already criticized his mentor, Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. Keynes's view of probability, that it was some sort of logical relationship, absolutely rooted in objective properties of the world, or logic even. And Ramsey just said, oh no, this is nonsense. It's just went back to Bayes and it's subjective betting odds. It's just to do with what odds we would be willing to accept in a gamble. And he actually derived the whole rules of probability from those basic ideas in 1926. And that was quite extraordinary. And simultaneously, similar work was going on in Italy with an actuary called Bruno De Finetti. So this sort of foundational work, without immediate practical application, was taking place. No one was taking much notice of it in the real world, in the outside world. But this change, it was a resource that later on, post-war, when the Bayesian, in a way, the real revolution started, people could refer back to. They rediscovered this work, essentially. And some people tried to keep the idea of inverse probability alive, right up to the Second World War. But actually, it was really difficult because people like Ronald Fisher had, by 1922, established an incredibly strong basis for statistical inference that did not use inverse probability. It was all based on the idea of likelihood, etc. And wonderful methods that we still teach today as the foundation for much of the way of standard statistical inference. There were, particular applications that were tried, but then in the Second World War, that's when people started applying the methods again. Now, one of the main applications was Alan Turing at Bletchley Park, breaking the Enigma codes. And he wrote in 1942 an entire discussion of the use of probability in breaking codes. And his description of probability is definitely in terms of a subjective expectation. Unfortunately, the British intelligence kept that paper for 60 years before they actually released it. No, 70, so 2012 before it was actually released to the public, which was slightly unfortunate. So Turing was doing all this Bayesian work, including using prior probabilities, updating evidence as new information came in. He was trying to work out, I think it was on the plug board, part of Enigma rather than the rotor settings, using Bayesian methods. But none of it was published. Afterwards, Jack Good, who'd worked with him, sort of hinted at it in some of his work, but they stuck to their secrecy. So it was all had to be rediscovered.
So when then do we get to the point, because we're now basically living in a Bayesian world, and The philosophical work was being done again in the 1920s, some of the practical application. And Bletchley Park, if people had known, that would have been a badge that signaled that this was worth doing. When does it break cover and just explode? Because at some point it's exploded because it is everywhere now.
Yeah. I think in the 1950s, there was a move towards trying to make statistics a rigorous subject. Because, I mean, this is, a bit of a secret I don't like to let people in on, but statistics is a bit of an intellectual shambles. As I said, we can't even agree what probability means. And there's multiple arguments continuing about what is an appropriate way of making inferences about underlying parameters. And there's still, basically three schools of thought, a Bayesian, a Fisherian, and a Neyman-Pearson approach, all arguing the whole time. So there was this real attempt in the 50s. People felt, oh yeah, we got to get this on a rigorous standard. And some people really pushed the Bayesian line. And that's when the word Bayesian first started being used, because it'd been called inverse probability. It was attributed far more to Laplace than Bayes, but it became known as Bayesian then. So the obscure clergyman was, in a sense, brought back into the daylight from his grave in Bunhill Fields in London. And people carried on with lots of intellectual arguments. So when I entered into this world in the 70s, and there were some still really vicious arguments between proponents of different schools of statistical inference, really harsh, on these very foundational issues. The problem is nobody could do anything.
Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast here to tell you about Michelob Ultra Courtside. It's getting fans closer to the NBA with a chance to win prizes like courtside seats, a trip to All-Star Weekend, and much more. Check it out at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access, Courtside 24-25 sweepstakes, no purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 and up. Begins on October 1st, 2024, ends July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Building a portfolio with Fidelity Basket Portfolios is kind of like making a sandwich. It's as simple as picking your stocks and ETFs, sort of like your meats and other toppings, and managing it as one big, juicy investment. Now that's pretty good. Learn more at Fidelity.com/baskets. Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC. Member NYSE SIPC.
So Bayes himself in the 1700s was stuck. He couldn't do the sums. So he had pages of algebra, attempting to solve these things. Laplace couldn't do all the calculations. He had to make some approximations, which are still used. The Laplace approximations is still a standard way of doing Bayesian analysis in machine learning and AI. People use Laplace approximations. So, the computation has been a problem for 250 years, that you can know what you want to do, you just can't do it. And that was all the way through the 70s and the 80s as I was working in this area, still only being able to do rather trivial problems. And then, at the late 1980s, everything changed. And around 1989, 1990, that was, I think, when the revolution started. And it was revolutionary. It was a massive change. It was an unbelievably exciting time to be working in this area. It must have been what it was like, I don't know, when Bohr and Heisenberg were working in, trying to work out different theories of quantum mechanics. Things were moving so fast, and people were meeting up at meetings and exchanging information, building software, showing new results. It was an incredibly exciting time.
And is the thing that changed computational capacity?
Yeah. Absolutely. It was just being able to do the sums.
So in the sense it had been waiting 250 years.
Yeah. And it's based on the fact that people gave up trying to do the maths and just said, we can't do it. We're going to rely on simulation methods, brute force simulation methods. And there's been some very nice techniques that have been developed, what's called Monte Carlo methods, where instead of trying to do maths, you give up and you just run lots of simulations and look at the average of the results. And this was developed in the Second War at Los Alamos to investigate how a nuclear explosion might be triggered. And then some nice results came out of physics. And then eventually statisticians caught hold of this in the 1980s and realized, wow, we can use this stuff. And I was part of a group that developed some software. And then suddenly, it was called Markov Chain Monte Carlo Methods, MCMC, everything changed. You could suddenly do all these problems that people had been struggling over for years trying to do the maths. So we're not going to bother to do the maths. Just write 3 lines of code, set the computer going, let it do 1 million iterations, and it comes up with an approximate answer that's good enough. It was an extraordinary time.
And did that put some of the controversies to bed, or did it sort of reanimate them in a different way? Because I can imagine if the long story here is an argument between people who think that you shouldn't allow so much subjectivity or ignorance into this pristine objective space of probability. Now you're franchising it out to the machines and just saying, just keep running this over and over again and we'll take what you come up with. Did that help, or did that sort of reinforce the belief for people who thought this was dodgy?
Well, I think it helped because up to then there'd always been this accusation, Bayes is all very well in theory, but it's just a theory, you can't actually use it. Suddenly, that was totally flipped on its head in that Bayes could handle the most difficult problems that other areas had been really struggling. Things with hundreds and thousands of parameters that traditional methods just could not deal with. Suddenly, Bayesian analysts could do. They could just leave the machine running long enough. And so it made it into a really practical force. And in a way, it almost stopped the ideological problems, the ideological analysis to some extent, because I think people became more ecumenical. Well, if you're dealing with this really big, complicated problem, you use a Bayesian method. And in normal, simple problems, you can use a classical, what might be called a classical method. But the basic arguments did not go away because people still objected to what's this prior information? What are you putting in that isn't coming from the data? Now, I think, and of course, you can tell that I'm wedded to a particular ideology on this, so I'm a totally biased viewpoint. I think that's a bit of a fake argument because in any statistical analysis, you are putting in huge amounts of judgment all the time, just assuming a normal distribution, just assuming your observations are independent, all this casual thing that everyone does all the time. That's a massive judgment and unjustified because nothing's got a normal distribution and no observations are independent. So, you're making all these untrue assumptions, and yet your analysis depends on them. So I think that's a fake objection, the prior input. But I think there is a point that you do want to know what it is and what influence it has. So it meant that there has always been a lot of attention to try to create what's called objective Bayes methods, which minimize the subjective input and try to get the data to speak for itself. And I think that's a very reasonable objective to try to do that. I think it's unachievable, but I think it's reasonable to try to get as close to it as you can.
As you say, one of the things that helps settle an argument like this is just if the practical results blow everyone else away. And in the area of machine learning in particular, that's where, as it starts to move on in leaps and bounds, it really does it incredibly rapidly. One of my most memorable moments as a complete outsider was listening to Demis Hassabis the day after he'd published the results for AlphaZero, the chess playing machine, explaining to a room mainly of computer scientists, but some non, like me, what they'd done. And me understanding for the first time the difference between what I thought chess machines were, which was they could think more moves ahead than the humans could. And they had inputted into them all of the best information so that they could plot better into the future. And him saying, we decided to let it learn for itself. And we weren't going to give it any prior information from us. We were just going to tell it the rules of the game, and it would just play over and over. And each time it played, it would learn. And I remember him saying within 3 hours, it was better than any human. Within 3 days, it was better than any other machine. And after a month, we switched it off because it was playing a game none of us could recognize. That's Bayesian, right? Or isn't it?
Well, it's not particularly Bayesian. The standard sort of, in a way, deep learning algorithms using their particular algorithm is not particularly, it is a learning algorithm, but it's not particularly Bayesian in what it's done. Pure deep learning large language models or something like that have used layers and layers and billions of parameters, and there is a learning algorithm from data. So it's learning, but it's not particularly doing Bayesian updating. The applications of Bayesian reasoning, I think self-driving cars are a better idea of application of Bayesian reasoning because Bayesian reasoning excels when you've got multiple different sources of information that need to be pulled in together. rather than a single big data source or a single big network that's learning from massive amount of experience, playing itself, essentially. But whereas with a self-driving car, it's actually got to recognize that that is a person, that is a bicycle, that's another car, that's a traffic light, that's another thing. It's identifying features of the landscape around it. And it already has got built into it very strong prior information about what it expects a person to do, how a bicycle to do. A person is not going to move at 100 miles an hour suddenly and things like that. It knows a lot already, and yet it's having to refine that prior information with what it's receiving from the outside about its particular circumstances. And that is the best Bayesian. And these are Bayesian reasoners for self-driving cars. So it's things that have an idea about how the world works. They have a model underlying them, and that is having to be refined all the time to deal with a new specific circumstance. And this is where the Bayesian brain comes in, because there's various people have theorized that this is how humans work. And I think it's established in neuroscience that, we have enormous prior expectations of what we're going to observe all the time. We don't just turn a corner and suddenly it's all completely new, or turn around. We have a very strong idea all the time of what we expect to see next. And then when we see things, it revises those sensations, gives us more signals to send back, and we understand our context. So it's, I think, open for argument how exactly technically Bayesian this is, but some people would say it is actually the updating does follow roughly the rules of Bayesian probability updating. But it's certainly in the way it works, it has got that, well, it's got a similarity to a self-driving car, which does use Bayesian updating methods to understand its environment.
We may or may not leave this in. This is for my own benefit. Try and make sense of the difference between the chess example and the self-driving car example. So in the case of the chess playing machine, it's trying to work out, is this likely to be a winning move? And with each new piece of information, it changes its understanding of that. But what it's not doing, which the self-driving car is doing, is trying to work out, is this thing that I'm seeing what it appears to be? Is the self-driving car much more strictly Bayesian because it is still genuinely doing this in the inverse way? It is trying to extrapolate from something that appears before it to what might lie behind that, which the chess computer doesn't need to do. It just has to work out what's likely to happen, and then it refines and refines and refines. Whereas this is trying to say, does this thing that I think is X, is it actually X?
It's actually working on probability of causes again. It's trying to work out it's going right back to that basic idea of what is underlying the sensations that are coming in from my inputs, what's actually going on out there. So it's trying to get a sort of understanding of the world around it as it currently is, rather than an algorithm like a large language model. It just produces something from its vast experiences that it's been trained on.
One area in which, as I understand it, Bayesian methods have been transformative. And so I noticed this, but without anyone trying to explain it to me. So I've never understood how it happened. But I can remember the night when I realized something had happened. It was the 2015 general election. And I was used to exit polls being a bit rubbish. And so I'm one of those people who was sort of scarred in a way by the 1987 and the 1992 elections, which the exit polls were way out, and actually they gave the Labour Party in both cases false hope. In 2015, the exit poll came out, and the thing that stood out on that exit poll was that the Liberal Democrats had been wiped out. And I remember the people, and John Curtis announced this, and the people in the studio were like, well, that's, we're used to exit polls being wrong, and that's clearly wrong. As more information comes in through the night, we will learn the true story. It was bang on, and it's been bang on ever since. And some of the polling before elections now, these different models, which I understand it are Bayesian models, have revolutionized anticipatory polling as well. How? How have Bayesian methods made such a difference to political polling?
I think that's when Paddy Ashdown had to eat his hat afterwards. That's the thing. Yeah, it's what's called MRP, multi-level regression and post-stratification. It was a very useful phrase. So, yeah, the exit polls are extraordinary bit of information. And those methods, just before I explain a little bit about them, but before that, they're not just applied now in political polling. For example, the COVID infection survey that was done throughout the UK during the pandemic and was extremely successful working at what was going on, used those methods. So it was a completely Bayesian analysis US, they actually brought in some great advisors from the States for that. So top Bayesians advising on the COVID infection survey. It, in fact, kind of enables you to work with a non-random sample. So with the exit poll, you've got a sample of interesting, largely, constituencies, and then you take a reasonably small sample, just a couple of hundred people maybe, in each of those constituencies. And the point about it, you use that data in order to build a model for how people might have changed their vote. So the basic thing also is that you always look at the transitions. You're trying to model the transitions from one election to the other. And that model is very sparse. I mean, you've only got a few people. You think about, you ask about 15,000 people or something in an exit poll. So it's incredibly small. And yet you're trying to model every constituency in the country, what's going to happen with every party. And yet your data is incredibly sparse. Now, that's where Bayesian methods come in, because you're allowed to introduce assumptions about the smoothness around the country. That you don't expect constituencies to be exactly the same, but you expect similar constituencies to have similar results. So you can what's called borrow strength from other constituencies in order to build a kind of national model using all this very sparse data. And you're using the characteristics of each individual that you've talked to, so you can build this model for how you would expect the person of this age and sex, what proportion would have changed their votes in each constituency. And yet you've never asked anybody in that constituency. And with the Bayesian methods, you can do that. And then what they do, of course, is apply those models across all the constituencies and the known demographics in those constituencies to produce an overall expected number of votes in each constituency, and from that get the total number of seats for each party, which has been staggeringly accurate year after year after year.
Yeah, it almost seems magical. It used to be thought that you needed as representative a sample as possible. That had always been, I think, the traditional basis of polling. So what's going on here is that even though it is a non-representative sample, you know enough about those kinds of people to extrapolate from that, and then you refine and refine as other of that kind of people give you more information?
Yeah, you're using information about those sorts of people from all over the country, but a bit like the insurance, that gives you a sort of general picture, but then you're refining it for particular constituencies as well. But as I said, not every constituency you're even asking anybody at all. They don't ask somebody in every constituency, and yet you are then predicting the vote share in that constituency. Because once you've got what's called a transition matrix, the proportion of people who are changing their vote, and you know what the vote last time, you can just apply that with measures of uncertainty to get a predicted vote share in that constituency, knowing the demographics. So it's a complex business that in principle does not require a representative sample. Now, you do, of course, have to actually cover all types of people. So that is important. You do need to spread your information that's coming in, but it doesn't have to be in proportion of that sort of person.
And I remember in the most recent election, it was very accurate for the two main parties, but John Curtis had to explain that for Reform, they were a little bit in the dark. The samples weren't big enough, but also actually the variation across constituencies, they didn't understand well enough, I think. And they were quite a long way out.
Yeah. And difficult when you haven't got a previous, as I said, you tend to model transitions rather than the actual share. But those methods have become very established, as I mentioned, not just in political polling. And again, it comes down to the strength of the Bayesian methods of dealing with really complicated problems, where you've got multiple sources of information, which then you are trying to apply down at the very local level. These are technological problems. So it's one of the things is that's why Bayesian methods have been so successful in machine learning. These are technological problems which you're trying to solve a problem. When we talk about sort of scientific issues, then it all gets a bit more tricky again.
One area where you might think that Bayesian methods would be very useful, again, maybe this is to oversimplify it, but one area where doing this in the inverse way would seem to be you'd want to adopt the most efficient method is to try and work out in a criminal case whether someone did it. And there might be multiple sources of complicated information that, say, a jury was having to assess in trying to decide a basic question. All of this stuff is in front of you, and you have got to work backwards from that to try and assess whether or not the person did it. Why is there still suspicion of Bayesian methods in the law courts?
You're not allowed to use them in British courts of law. It's been officially banned to use Bayes' theorem.
Almost as though it was heretical.
Yeah, well, because it's argued that it's doing the work of the jury. It's the work of the jury to combine the different sources of evidence, apparently. And what Bayes' theorem does is combine different sources of evidence. It goes back a long way. It was used in the Dreyfus trial in 1899 in France. Basically, it's the method then used by Alan Turing for code breaking, et cetera, et cetera. And it's when you've got, multiple items of evidence and you can work out what's called the likelihood ratio, which is the probability of getting that evidence under what the prosecution are claiming, divided by the probability of getting that evidence under what the defense are claiming. So it's the sort of evidence for or against the two claims. And likelihood ratios are allowed in court, single ones. For example, for DNA, when you talk about a random match probability of 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million or something, that's a likelihood ratio. So you're allowed single ones. What you're not allowed to do is combine them. That's just, you're not allowed to.
But the assumption is the jury's meant to do this for itself. How? I wouldn't know how.
Exactly. And the point is that combining multiple sources of evidence that only provide a sort of, none of them are absolutely prove the point. They're just all implicit, or they're all partial contributions to the claims being made. It's incredibly difficult. It is totally unintuitive. I mean, probability and handling probabilistic evidence is just the most unintuitive thing I can ever think of. And yet we expect juries to be able to do this.
So the thing that is not allowed is a Bayesian expert to come and say, you've heard this, you've heard this, you've heard this, you've heard this. I'm the person who can tell you how to combine those. That's not allowed. Yeah,
you're not allowed to do that. And also, you're not allowed to bring in a prior probability in the court either. So it's lovely when it is done. I mean, the example I always use is when Richard III was dug up, or the skeleton was dug up in this car park in Leicester, and they did a Bayesian analysis of, was it Richard III? And they looked at each piece of evidence, the radiocarbon dating. Well, that only provided a likelihood ratio of 2. So it was twice as likely to occur if it was Richard III compared with if it wasn't Richard III. The scoliosis, the curvature of the spine, likelihood ratio about 200, quite a lot. And they multiplied all these bits together, the post-mortem wounds, the age and sex, and they got to no single piece of evidence actually was that strong, but multiplied them together and you got a likelihood ratio of 6 million. And that was enough to get him buried in Leicester Cathedral.
And so something that seemed very unlikely, which is the first skeleton you dig up in this car park is the one that you were looking for, turned out to be the one they were looking for.
Yeah, 11 o'clock on the first morning of the dig, they dug up the skeleton, and that was it. They could have all gone home. So that was published. That's the official justification for the remains of King Richard III. But that wouldn't stand up in a court of law. You couldn't do that in court.
And in the absence of Bayesian methods being allowed in courts of law, you do get some notorious miscarriages of justice, don't you?
Yes, yeah. The classic one is Sally Clark, this woman who's had 2 babies die young, 2 cot deaths. And they brought in this expert who said, cot deaths are very rare, 1 in 4,700 or something like that. So the chance of 2 deaths is, 1 in 73 million. No, sorry, it's 1 in 8,000. So 1 in 73 million. And, this is like winning the Grand National 10 times in a row. And this was very influential in people's thinking, and it's completely wrong. And it's not just wrong because cot deaths are not independent. The crucial thing is that he was talking about the probability of this happening by chance, but the probability of a woman murdering both of her children was even lower. So he didn't look at the probabilities of the 2 competing hypotheses. He just looked at the probability, if she was innocent, this is the probability of it happening. But actually, the prior probability of somebody murdering their 2 children is even lower. So the reasoning was now that wasn't, there's statisticians who got up and said that, and the judge ruled them out and said, this isn't rocket science or anything like that. Yeah, and yet the point is that as statisticians claim on numerous legal cases that the ability to judge when something is beyond coincidence is not to be left to human intuition. We are very bad at this sort of thing. We are not good reasoners about rare events and judging how rare, this couldn't just be chance. We're just not very good at it. And so we really need care and caution about drawing those conclusions. And of course, she got off on appeal.
I want to ask you one more question, and I'm aware I'm asking it to you as someone who has a stake in this because you fought these battles. But we have moved from an age, I think even people who, I don't know how widespread recognition of the term Bayesian is, but it's definitely more out there than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. And we've moved from it being a dirty word to almost a badge of honor, and particularly in Silicon Valley, but also people who are influenced by that mindset. It's kind of you're Bayesian or you're nothing. And this is going to, in the end, it's going to solve everything. Do you think there's a danger that the pendulum has swung too far the other way, and there's a sort of hubris around some of the real proselytizers for the fact that some of them will say the Bayesian revolution is the most important revolution of them all?
Yeah, I mean, I've been involved in this for 50 years, and I become much more ecumenical, I think, and I'm not a big proselytizer. In fact, I often don't mention the B word, as I refer to it, when I'm writing stuff that actually is rather Bayesian about what is the meaning of probability or something. I tend not to use the B word because it is associated with this sort of, millennial movement sort of thing, and I don't think that's an advantage at all. I think it's very much more reasonable to look at, what is the appropriate way of handling this particular challenge that you've got. Partly because also, whenever I read that an analysis is Bayesian, I become very suspicious because, I know, okay, fair enough. What have they put into it? What have they put into it? What are the assumptions? How important is the prior assumptions that they're putting in? And I want to see them. And they're not always transparent. And so I actually am slightly dubious about it. Now, it's fine if it's just trying to solve a technological problem, predicting, who's going to repay their mortgages or exit polls or something, which is just trying to make a prediction and seeing how good it is, or surveys. That's just fine. When it comes to science, when you're trying to conclude about what drugs work on what people and so on, then it's a different matter. And I want the analysis to be very transparent and not to be obscure. But so saying that a lot of science that's done is using Bayesian methods, particularly, in complex area, environmental science, ecology, and things like that, because the data is so complex. It's not just a simple experiment you do in a laboratory and there's some figures and you can write a paper on it. You're using multiple sources of evidence and imperfect evidence and trying to bring it together as a whole to draw to some conclusion. And you use Bayesian method because they really are the only way you can do it. So it is growing not only in technology and machine learning and areas, but in science, and quite rightly. But it's got to be done with caution. And I am suspicious, I think, of, I used to go to the conference and sing the Bayesian songs and, metaphorically march down the street waving a flag. And I've done all that. And now, actually, I think, maybe it's just because I'm old, I think one needs to approach this in a fairly sort of sober, balanced way.
Is it true, therefore, that because it does rely on prior assumptions, there has to be a certain amount of humility attached to it, in the sense it needs to be transparent because you mustn't assume too much about your own starting point. And yet, in the sort of aggressive, macho Silicon Valley version, the one thing you wouldn't associate with it is humility.
So I've got to give my book a plug. And my book on the art of uncertainty, it hardly mentions the word rationality at all, but it mentions humility again and again and again. There's massive need for, once you admit that uncertainty and probability is a subjective relationship to the world, it really becomes a matter of integrity to be humble, because you have to admit that you are putting a lot personally into your analysis. Now, I think that's true, as I mentioned before, of every scientific analysis, as judgments go and assumptions go into it. But in the Bayesian one, it's even more explicit and clear what's happening. And so you really have to have some caution about what you're putting in and what influence it might have. The example I always use is a lovely phrase I don't know, Cromwell's law, that was named by Dennis Lindley, who is one of my Bayesian mentors. And it's a plea for humility. And Cromwell, was arguing with the Church of Scotland. He didn't want to have a battle with them. And they were being very stubborn. And he wrote them a letter saying, "I beseech thee in the bowels of Christ, think it possible you may be mistaken." And so Cromwell's law is to think it possible you may be mistaken. And that plea for humility translates in a Bayesian framework. You can actually formalize it by, you have your prior distribution, but you keep it a bit back. You keep a little smidgen of probability for the possibility you may be wrong. And you spread that over all the other things that you actually don't think are very likely, or you might otherwise rule out. And what that does is it allows you, when you're learning from experience, to very rapidly, if something comes along, so, oh my God, this didn't fit with my previous pattern, it shifts incredibly quickly because of that little smidgen you've left over. So the Bayesian world, the Bayesian analysis can formalize humility, mathematicize it, which I think is a very beautiful idea. But just this general idea that whatever you're doing in any analysis you do, to think it possible you may be mistaken.
There is a new edition of our fortnightly newsletter available now. To get it, just sign up at our website, ppfideas.com. Each newsletter gives lots of extra information about our most recent episodes, including clips, links, further reading, and in each newsletter there is something written by me. This time I'm writing about Donald Trump, the question of whether or not he is a tyrant through the medium of poetry, specifically a poem by W.H. Auden. If you'd like to read that and everything else in the newsletter, just sign up now. Coming up on our history of revolutionary ideas, we're going back to a more conventional political revolution, or rather a whole set of revolutions that happened in a single year. The year is 1848, and our guide is going to be the historian Chris Clark. Over 3 episodes, he is going to take us through the events of 1848, the liberal revolution, the radical revolution, the counter-revolution, the revolutionary events and ideas at the heart of the 19th century and what they still mean today. Do join us for those. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave podcast network.
Science education is key to creating a successful future, but the challenges have never been greater. I'm Matt Kaplan, host of Safeguarding Sound Science, Climate Change Edition. Join us for outstanding conversations with the leading researchers, policy experts, and teachers who are fighting to keep misinformation and pseudoscience out of our classrooms and off our screens. Subscribe to Safeguarding Sound Science on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, or wherever you like to listen.